Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another session from the Alternative University of the Air. My name is Jo Brewis, and I work in the Faculty of Business and Law at the Open University Business School. And I'm really pleased to be here today to talk to you about menopause and work, which is something that I've been researching and speaking about and trying to do some activism around for nearly 4 years now. So just to begin with, some facts and figures about the menopause, because the work that we've been doing suggests to us that there's still quite a lot of misunderstanding out there, quite a lot of mythology, and to be honest, probably quite a lot of taboo as well. So the menopause is the time in a woman's life when her menstrual periods stop for good. But clinically speaking, the menopause doesn't actually occur until 12 months after her last menstrual period. The symptoms of menopause usually start somewhere around 48. That's the average age, at least in the global north. And the age at which a woman attains menopause is on average 51. There are all sorts of different symptoms that can go along with menopause. The classic ones we all know about are periods being extremely erratic, often quite heavy, certainly unpredictable, hot flushes and night sweats. Menopause can also bring about anxiety and depression, lack of concentration, aching limbs, insomnia, poor memory, all sorts of different symptoms, really. You name it, and the menopause might be at the heart of it. And the reason why our bodies go through these symptoms are, put simply, fluctuating levels of hormones as we near the end of our reproductive lives. And these hormones include estrogen, progesterone even, and yes, also testosterone, which can often explain things like vaginal dryness and loss of libido at menopause. But it's also really important to suggest and emphasize that menopause is unique to every person that experiences it. Some people literally do sail through menopause, to use the vernacular. Other people suffer quite badly. So, for example, one of the most common symptoms reported as a result of menopause are hot flushes. And 75% of women going through menopause will experience hot flushes, but 25% of those will find them extremely difficult, not to say debilitating. So there is an enormous variety of not only collections of symptoms, but also the severity that affects each individual woman. Menopause is also not necessarily a midlife experience. So about 1 in 100 women will go through what's known as premature or early menopause, and that's deemed to be if you experience menopause before the age of 40. And it's also very important to remember that when I use women and female and she and so on, when I'm talking about menopause, I'm using those words as placeholders, because there are also a lot of people who identify as transgender and non-conforming who will also experience menopause if they have a uterus and ovaries. So it is a very variable experience, even from a clinical point of view. It's also the case that nowadays women live for, on average, a third of their lives or more beyond menopause. So whereas in the early 1900s it was very much a later life experience, so on average you attained it at 47 and then your life expectancy was 49, nowadays, as I say, you attain it at 51 and on average women's life expectancy is 83. So we live for far longer now after the menopause, and for a good many of those years we are also likely to be working. Now, there are several reasons why menopause is such an important topic in terms of workplaces, but just before I go into those, let me give you a little bit of context around how menopause can affect work. So some survey work that we did in conjunction with TUC Education, we ran a survey last summer, 2018, and we got just shy of 5,400 responses. And what the women who were reporting menopausal symptoms were telling us is that, in ascending order, the 5 symptoms that make work or can make work quite miserable for menopausal women are, first of all, insomnia, secondly, anxiety and worry, thirdly, focus and concentration, fourth, hot flushes, And the worst symptom reported by this group of women was fatigue. So these symptoms can have a very significant impact on the quality of a woman's working life. But the reverse is also true in the sense that work can actually exacerbate symptoms. So the classic one here is working in a very warm environment, or an environment where you're not able to open a window or control the temperature. That can really make hot flushes a problem. Equally, if you have to wear a heavy uniform or a synthetic uniform, or any kind of workwear which is heavy and made of non-breathable fabric, that can also make your work life much more problematic, because again, it can exacerbate the regularity and the intensity of hot flushes. So it's always a bi-directional relationship. Symptoms can make work more difficult, but equally certain kinds of workplaces, certain kinds of conditions, things like shift work, can also make menopausal symptoms more difficult. Now, we think at the moment is exactly the right time to be talking about the importance of menopause at work, and there are 4 very good reasons for this. So the first reason is straightforward demographics. Midlife women, so that's women between the age of 50 and 64, in other words, in that menopausal age bracket, are much more likely to be either staying in work or coming back to work after, for example, children leaving home. And indeed, the numbers of those women in the UK and across the global north are growing and growing and growing. It's the fastest growing group of workers in the labour market. It's also the case that the gender pay gap in the United Kingdom at the moment stands on 18.4% average difference between men and women's wages, and that gap is actually at its biggest for women and men in their 50s. Again, the bracket in which women are more or less likely to be menopausal. And equally, if we then fast forward a little bit, the gender pension gap, which in the UK currently stands at a horrifying 39.5%, we would argue that that is very much a product of the gender pay gap, and that the gender pay gap in and of itself may be inextricably bound up with women struggling with menopausal symptoms in midlife. So there are demographic reasons why employers should be taking menopause seriously. There are also economic reasons. Put simply, it costs an awful lot of money to replace somebody. So, for example, someone who leaves work because she's really struggling with her menopausal symptoms. And indeed, Oxford economics data tell us that if you earn £25,000 a year, which is quite a lot lower than the median UK salary, then it will cost your employer over £30,000 to replace you in direct recruitment and selection costs, and also other costs of lost productivity, lost knowledge, and so on, while you bring somebody in and get them up to speed to replace whoever it is that's left. So there's also a very strong economic or business case for employers to take this issue seriously. The third issue is legal. So menopause is potentially protected under 2 sets of UK legislation. And again, this is similar across the global north. So we have the Equality Act 2010, where we are protected against discrimination on the basis of sex, age, disability, and gender. And there's also the health and safety legislation, which could indeed be invoked if, for example, lack of care for a menopausal woman was deemed to be breaching an employer's legal duty of care to ensure her health, safety, and well-being while she's at work. And there have already been 2 employment tribunals, both brought under the Equality Act, one against British Telecom in 2012, which was taken on the basis of sex discrimination, and one against, very ironically, Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, which was taken last year in 2018, and that was taken on the basis of disability discrimination, because this woman's symptoms were so severe that they were deemed to constitute a disability under the equality legislation. And the fourth reason is what we tend to call the social responsibility reason. In other words, it's just the right thing to do. When you look at statistics, for example, a survey that was done in conjunction with ITV and Wellbeing of Women back in 2016, half of the women surveyed said that they'd seriously considered leaving work altogether because of their symptoms. 25% of those women said they'd seriously considered leaving work altogether because of symptoms. And half of those who responded said that their menopausal symptoms were making their work life really quite miserable. So in order to create a happy, healthy working environment for everybody, but in this specific case for midlife women, we think it's very important that employers do pay attention to this issue. And also when we consider that it's very socially and financially important for women to be able to work for as long as they like, that adds another reason to this bundle of cases, as we tend to call them. But the good news for employers is that actually a lot of the reasonable adjustments, as the legislation puts it, that can be made, and we would argue should be made, can be very cheap, very easy, and very convenient to introduce. We think the first and most important thing is to raise awareness in workplaces about the menopause, about what it is and how it can impact on midlife women. We think that's the first step to changing cultures, bringing menopause out in the open and beginning to make it a topic of conversation that's no more remarkable, for example, than a woman going to her boss and saying, great news, I'm pregnant, I'd like to take maternity leave from this date and come back after the baby's born on this date. That's a routine conversation in everyday workplaces now. Not for 1 minute saying that pregnancy and maternity discrimination don't exist anymore, but we are so much further forward with that than we were 30 or 40 years ago. And we believe that those same sorts of conversations around menopause should be as normal as they are around pregnancy and maternity. So we'd like to see educational campaigns. We'd like to see equality and diversity training, particularly for line managers around the menopause. Training for them also in having sensitive or perhaps slightly tricky conversations with menopausal women. We'd like to see tailored absence policies so that repeated absences due to severe menopausal symptoms don't pile up so they become a performance management issue. We would like to see that kind of situation treated as an ongoing health issue. We'd like menopausal women to have the benefit of flexible working patterns if that would make their lives easier. We'd like them to have informal support in the form perhaps of menopause cafes or even online forums at work, which they could participate in, perhaps even without identifying themselves. We'd like also for there to be the facility for adjustments to be made to workplace environments. So really obvious things like access to cold drinking water, the ability to ventilate their environments. Access to natural light has been shown to have a very good effect in terms of making menopausal symptoms less problematic. The facility to ask for alternative forms of uniforms or workwear. So, for example, to request a uniform that's made out of breathable wicking fabric as opposed to one that's very synthetic. We'd like there to be spaces where women can go and decompress and take some time out if, for example, they're suffering from a hot flush. And the list goes on. But as you can see, some of those facilities, and another one that's just come to mind is USB desk fans, again for women suffering hot flushes, are actually quite easy and simple and cheap for employers to introduce. Others perhaps are trickier and will take longer and eventually will cost more money. But again, the message that the team and I like to put forward to all employers is that menopause is a phase. It doesn't go on forever. And even if you look at it from a brutally business point of view, we tend to prefer the social responsibility argument, but even if you're just looking at it from a business point of view, the massive benefits and gains that employers will receive if they look after their midlife women employees, who will then feel happier and healthier and much more motivated to work, we think outweigh any cost that might be borne as a result of making these changes. And something else to add is that every single conversation that we have in the workplace, every time we talk to menopausal women about work, one of the things that they always say to us is just having some understanding is extremely important. Even if nothing else is in place, if they feel able to go and have conversations with colleagues or their trade union reps or their line managers, that actually goes a long way to them feeling better supported in the workplace. So one of the other mottos that we tend to come out with, however bizarre it sounds, is that menopause is not a women's issue. And what we mean by that is that menopause is not just a women's issue, because we firmly believe that if a woman's struggling, that will have an impact on her colleagues, it will have an impact on her line manager, and it will also, of course, have an impact on her friends and her family outside the workplace. So really all we're looking for, very low-key ambition, nothing very ambitious here. We would really like to try and change the culture around menopause in United Kingdom workplaces. The really good news is that lots of employers are now taking very good steps towards making workplaces more menopause friendly. But what I should say, just as I close out, is that as an active trade unionist, I'm very, very happy to say that it's actually trade unions who've been at the forefront of all of this sort of activity, and indeed were the first movers in the UK in the early 2000s when the TUC released a report and a set of recommendations around supporting women in midlife. So nearly 20 years later now, the trajectory still continues, but we do have a long way to go. And again, I would just urge everybody out there, whether you're an employee or an employer, to just try and raise your awareness about menopause and be sensitive and compassionate to people around you who may be going through it and may be struggling, perhaps particularly from my point of view, in the workplace. Okay, I hope you found that helpful and interesting. Thanks very much, and goodbye.